Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are checking out our first Ryzen 7000 series processor, the Ryzen 5 7600X. Now we're starting with the cheaper CPU, as I suspect this is the model most of you are interested in, but don't worry, I also have the 7700X, 7900X, and 7950X, and those reviews will be coming over the next few days. But rather than lump all four CPUs into a single review, I wanted to take a close look at each one, run a few interesting tests, compare them to their competitors, do all the stuff we normally do in reviews. So with that, let's quickly go over the 7600X's specifications, and then of course we'll jump into the benchmark results. Now much of this information has already been covered in our Zen 4 announcement video, but for those of you not yet up to speed, here's the rundown. The Ryzen 5 7600X is a 6-core 12-thread processor that clocks between 4.7 GHz and 5.3 GHz depending on the load. It's composed of a single 5nm core complex die, or CCD, along with a 6nm I/O die. There's 32GB of L3 cache, 6MB of L2, DDR5 support, 28 PCIe 5.0 lanes, a 105W TDP, and it's designed for the new AM5 socket, so there's a bit going on here. Additionally, when compared to Zen 3, Zen 4 boosts peak clock speeds by 16% to 5.7 GHz, improves IPC by 13%, and doubles the L2 cache capacity. It also integrates an RDNA 2 graphics solution and is built using TSMC's 5nm process. Now, like the 5600X, the 7600X is coming in at $300 US. So it's not a cheap processor, and while some might scoff at that price for a mere 6 cores, it's expected to be much faster than the 5600X, so perhaps the price will be easier to justify, and by the end of this video, we should have our answer. There's really a lot more to go over, but we'll talk about many of the new features and changes as we work through the review. So let's go over the test system specs and then get on with it. I've been busy over the past few weeks updating all of our CPU data, and as a result we have 17 CPUs for comparison. For the AM4 platform, I've got a range of Zen 2 and Zen 3 CPUs with popular models such as the AMD Ryzen 5 3600, Ryzen 7 3700X, and of course, the Ryzen 5 5600X. But there are half a dozen more models also included. Then I've gone and included Intel's 10th gen series, including popular Core i5, i7 and i9 models, and due to time I've skipped the 11th gen as that was a bit of a flop anyway. Then for Intel's 12th gen core series, I've tested using DDR4 3200 dual rank CL14 memory and DDR5 6400 single rank CL32 memory, and I've included from the Core i3 12100 up to the Core i9 12100K for this comparison. Now, the new AM5 test system is based on the MSI Meg X670E Ace, and AMD has insisted that all reviewers use the supplied DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, so that's what we've done. However, I've also done some testing with DDR5 6400, along with some other things, and you'll see all of that in this video. Finally, please note all testing was conducted using the GeForce RTX 3090 Ti, Windows 11, and Resizable BAR was enabled for all test configurations. Okay, let's get into it. Just quickly before we dive into the blue bar graphs, here's a look at clock behavior in Cinebench R23. After an hour of load testing, the 7600X maintained an all-core frequency of 5.2 GHz using the Be Quiet Pure Loop 2 FX 360mm liquid cooler installed inside the Be Quiet Silent Base 802. Interestingly, despite claiming a maximum boost frequency of 5.3 GHz, the 7600X regularly had a core clocked at 5.45 GHz when running the Cinebench R23 single-core test. And this behavior was observed on the MSI Meg X670E Ace. Starting with the Cinebench R23 multi-core results, we see that the new 7600X is basically on par with the 5800X, which is of course a Zen 3 based 8-core 16-thread processor. And that means, despite the fact that the 5800X packs 33% more cores, the IPC and frequency uplift of the 7600X is able to get it almost alongside the higher core count model. With a score of just over 15,000 points, the 7600X is 24% faster than the 3700X, and amazingly just 6% slower than the 10-core 20-thread Core i9 10900K. All of that said, critically, it is 12% slower than the Core i5 12600K, so for core-heavy productivity workloads, the 7600X will have its work cut out for it. As expected though, the single-core performance looks amazing, basically matching the Intel Alder Lake Core i5 and i7 parts. When compared to the 5600X, you're looking at a 28% improvement in single-core performance, and an almost 60% boost from the old Ryzen 5 3600. So again, quite incredible really. Moving on to the 7-zip file manager compression test, we again find very strong performance from the 7600X, and in fact, this time it's able to edge out the 12600K even when pairing the Intel CPU with DDR5 6400 memory. And this performance also saw another 28% uplift from the 5600X, as it was slightly faster than the 5800X and 5800X 3D. In fact, we're really looking at 3900X performance here, which is insane given that CPU packs twice as many cores. Yeah, they are Zen 2 cores, but still, very impressive stuff. Now, the decompression performance is more mixed. When compared to the 3900X, it's now 26% slower, but it was also only 8% slower than the 5800X. Meanwhile, it basically matched the Core i9 10900K and edged the 12600K out by an almost 20% margin, and that's with the older late Core i5 using DDR5 6400 memory. Next, we have the Blender Open Data benchmark, and here the 7600X is neck and neck with the Core i5 12600K, making it slightly faster than the 5800X 3D, or slightly slower than the 5800X. So overall, another impressive result that sees the new 6-core Zen 4 CPU outperforming its predecessor in the 5600X by a whopping 40% margin. The Corona benchmark shows more of the same. Here the 7600X was only a fraction slower than the 5800X, but roughly 40% faster than the 5600X. Having said all of that though, disappointingly, it was slower than the 12600K by an 8% margin. Certainly not a huge loss, but it is a bit disappointing to see. Now, for scrubbing through timelines and playback of 4K footage in Premiere Pro 2022, the 7600X is certainly very mighty for a 6-core CPU, beating the 5800X in the Puget Systems benchmark, as well as the Core i9 12900K. So an easy win over the 12600K here, beating it by a 26% margin. The 7600X was also very impressive in the Puget Systems Photoshop benchmark, falling just short of the 12900K, and that meant it was 16% faster than the 12600K when pairing the Core i5 part with DDR5 6400 memory. This also resulted in a massive 30% uplift from the 5600X and a 61% improvement over the Ryzen 5 3600. The last Adobe application test we have is After Effects, and again, the 7600X does very well here, beating all Zen 3 base CPUs to narrowly edge out the Core i5 12600K, basically losing only to the 12700K and 12900K. In short, we're looking at a 36% boost over the 5600X and a 57% boost over the 3600. Finally, the last application benchmark looks at compilation performance, and here the 7600X is roughly on par with the 12600K, making it 21% slower than the 5900X. And given that CPU packs twice as many cores, that's a stellar result. We're also looking at a 54% performance improvement from the 5600X, which again is pretty insane. Now, time for the gaming benchmarks, and we'll start with Factorio, which is very cache sensitive and really only looks at single core performance. The 7600X was amazingly just 6% slower than the 1200K using DDR5 6400 and 12% faster than the 12600K, also using DDR5. Compared to the 5600X, we're looking at a 19% improvement and then another jaw-dropping 63% increase over the old Ryzen 5 3600. Now, let's take a look at the Watch Dogs Legion results, and I'd say we're off to a good start here. 143 FPS places it alongside the 5800X 3D and 12600K using DDR5. It was slower than the 1200K by a 9% margin, but given the price, I'd say that is still quite a stellar result. It was also a 20% uplift over the 5600X and a 14% boost from the 5950X. The Rainbow Six extraction results are a bit unexpected, as here the 7600X was slightly slower than the 5600X. That said, performance overall was hardly terrible, as the 7600X was just 5% slower than the fastest CPU tested here, the 12900K running DDR5 memory. So although somewhat underwhelming, it's really not a bad result. Now, a game where the 7600X does impress is Hitman 3, and damn it was fast here, pumping out 230 frames per second on average, beating the 12100K, which was using faster DDR5 6400 memory. And this meant it was 14% faster than 12600K, again using DDR5, and 17% faster than the 5800X 3D, while destroying AMD's previous 6-core part, the 5600X, by a very convincing 32% margin. Now, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands has been included, not because it's a super CPU demanding game, but rather because it's a good representation of how CPU demanding many modern games are. That is to say, when using a relatively modern CPU, most games are going to end up being GPU bound, even when using an RTX 3090 Ti at 1080p, as we see in this example. And this game can be useful for testing low-end CPUs, but for the 7600X it just shows that we're able to max out the RTX 3090 Ti, matching other high-end CPUs. Next we have F122, and this is another excellent showing for the 7600X, pumping out 334 FPS, making it faster than even the 5800X 3D, which was the previous champion in this title. This means the 7600X is 10% faster than 12100K using DDR5 memory, and an impressive 22% faster than 12600K, also using DDR5 6400. We're also looking at a 27% performance boost over the 5600X and a mind-blowing 78% increase over the 3600. The Spider-Man Remastered performance is also impressive, despite the fact that the 7600X only matched the 12600K, making it quite a bit slower than the 12900K. Still, it did beat the 5800X 3D, and quite convincingly when looking at the 1% lows, which are often helped by the higher frequency DDR5 memory. Then when compared to the 5600X, the 7600X was faster by an impressive 24% margin. The 7600X matched the 5800X 3D in Shadow of the Tomb Raider with 189 FPS on average, making it 1.5% slower than the Alder Lake CPUs. A margin that it would likely make up using DDR5 6400 memory, and that's something we'll look at shortly. Performance overall though is certainly good, and we're looking at a decent 13% uplift over the 5600X. Moving on to Horizon Zero Dawn, the 7600X again shines here, delivering by far the best result with 211 FPS on average. This made it 7% faster than the 5800X 3D and 13% faster than the 12900K using DDR5, and then a massive 28% faster than the 12600K, again using DDR5. So total domination over the Intel CPUs for the new 7600X in this title. Now, a game where Ryzen doesn't typically shine is Cyberpunk 2077, and that's still true of the 7600X. That said, overall the result is very good, beating the 5800X 3D by a 6% margin, and the 5600X by a 10% margin. Not massive, but it's certainly an improvement. That said, when compared to Alder Lake, the results are a little bit underwhelming, as it trailed the 12600K using DDR5 by a 5% margin, and the 12900K by a 15% margin. As a side note, if you're wondering why I keep comparing AMD's new $300 CPU to Intel's 1200K, it's because AMD did exactly that, claiming overall the 7600X is faster, so we're certainly going to look at that. ACC is a game where the 5800X 3D completely shreds, and unfortunately the 7600X simply can't live with it in this one, trailing the 3D part by a large 14% margin. Still, despite that, it was the next best thing, beating the Core i9 1200K by a 3% margin and the 12600K using DDR5 by a massive 20% margin, so a highly positive result overall here. Traditionally, AMD CPUs have kind of sucked in the Riftbreaker, at least relative to Intel CPUs, and even the 5800X 3D struggled to knock off the Alder Lake parts. And while the 7600X couldn't beat the 12900K using DDR5, it did edge out the 12600K by a slim margin, so overall a decent result here. Last up we have Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and this is another ripper for the 7600X, pumping out 487 FPS with the RTX 3090 Ti to make it the fastest CPU we've tested to date. This result made it 8% faster than the 12900K using DDR5 and a massive 32% faster than the 12600K also using DDR5. This is a single-core game that relies on single-thread performance, which is why the 7600X does so well here, and the restructured cache probably helps a lot as well. Now, time for a look at the 12-game average, and as expected, the 7600X is right up there with the 12900K using DDR5 memory, giving it a fairly comfortable 9% lead over the 12600K, also using high-speed DDR5 memory. Impressively, it also beat the 5800X 3D, only by a 4% margin on average, but still, that's a stellar result that I think few would have expected. Then when compared to the Ryzen 5 5600X, which is still an exceptionally good gaming CPU, the 7600X was on average 19% faster, which is an incredible generation-on-generation uplift. Then for those of you still rocking a Ryzen 5 3600 and have been hanging out for an upgrade, the 54% uplift on average offered by the 7600X will be hard to refuse, even if you do have to upgrade your memory and motherboard. That said, the 5800X 3D might be an easier and more cost-effective option of achieving that level of performance. Now, for a look at total system power consumption. Given the extremely high operating frequency of the 7600X, it's probably of little surprise to learn that it consumes a similar level of power to that of the 5800X, reaching a total system draw of 226 watts. That said, performance was also on par with the 5800X, so we're looking at comparable performance per watt to that of Zen 3, as well as Intel's Alder Lake architecture, at least when compared to the 12600K. So when it comes to power supply requirements, we're looking at pretty basic demands here. Now, when it comes to cooling, the Zen 4 CPUs intentionally give the impression that they're difficult to cool by delivering as much performance as possible by taking full advantage of the thermal and power headroom. AMD says with the new AM5 socket and higher TDP, Zen 4 processors will run into a thermal wall before they hit a power wall. This means under heavy load they'll sit at TJ max, which is about 95 degrees Celsius for the Ryzen 7000 series, and this will of course be particularly true for the 12 and 16 core models. AMD has stressed that this behavior is intended and by design, and say it's important to note TJ max is the maximum safe operating temperature, not the absolute maximum temperature. In the case of Zen 4, the processors are designed to run at TJ max 24/7 without risk of damage or deterioration. AMD went on to say that 95 degrees is not running hot, rather Zen 4 will intentionally go to this temperature as much as possible under load because the power management system knows this is the ideal way to squeeze the most performance out of the chip without damaging it. And I should note that moving away from the 1331-pin PGA AM4 socket to the 1718-pin LGA for AM5, that the good news is that almost all AM4 coolers will be compatible with the AM5 socket, the only exceptions being those that are secured from the rear side of the motherboard, as the backplates are now non-removable for AM5 boards. This does though mean that all coolers can now be installed without requiring rear access to the motherboard, as is the case with HEDT processors, so that is excellent news. Now for testing, we're using the Be Quiet Pure Loop 2 FX 360mm liquid cooler, which is 100% compatible with AM5. After an hour of looping the Cinebench R23 multi-core test with the Pure Loop 2 FX installed inside the Be Quiet Silent Base 802, we recorded a peak CPU temperature of 93 degrees, so just shy of the 95 degree TJ max that AMD says the CPU targets for maximum performance. This allowed for a sustained all-core frequency of 5.2 GHz, and that delivered the performance shown in this review. It will be interesting to go back and revisit these Zen 4 processors using a range of coolers to see how cooling performance affects CPU performance, but that will be an investigation for another time. Now, as I noted earlier, AMD provided DDR5 6000CL30 memory for our testing, and this was supplied to all reviewers globally as AMD believes this to be the sweet spot memory for Zen 4. Now, the default fabric frequency for Zen 4 CPUs is 1733 MHz for DDR5 5200, as this is the official memory speed. However, as is often the case, higher memory speeds can be achieved, and with AMD pointing to DDR5 6000 as the sweet spot, it is to be assumed that all Zen 4 CPUs will handle a fabric frequency of 2000 MHz. Now, previously with Ryzen 5000 series CPUs, you wanted to keep the FCLK, UCLK, and MCLK tied at a 1:1:1 ratio for optimal performance. But with Zen 4, that's no longer the case. Rather, the memory controller, or IMC, is best kept at a 1:1 ratio with the DDR5 memory, while the fabric operates at a 3:2 ratio. So as an example, using DDR5 4800, that'd see the IMC run at 2400 MHz and the fabric at 1600 MHz. Or for DDR5 6000, which I used, sees the IMC clock to 3000 MHz and the fabric at 2000 MHz. So let's try a few different DDR5 memory kits and check out the results. Starting with Hitman 3, we see that the DDR5 6000 kit was good for 230 FPS, and I wasn't able to beat that by a convincing margin with DDR5 6400 and a fabric frequency of 2133 MHz, although the 1% lows were improved by 4%. Running the DDR5 6400 memory with the fabric set to 2000 MHz reduced performance, so as AMD suggested, that is a suboptimal configuration. Now, with DDR5 5600, you'd ideally want a fabric speed of 1866 MHz, but that didn't exist, with either 1800 or 2000 MHz being the nearest options, so I went with 2000 MHz. Here, DDR5 5600 was just 3% slower than DDR5 6000. Then we see that 5200 is 7% slower than 6000, and finally the cheap 8GB DDR5 4800 modules that I recently purchased were 13% slower, so that's far from ideal, though in this particular title that was enough to match the 12600K using DDR5 6400, as well as the 5800X 3D. When testing with the Riftbreaker, we see that DDR5 5600 and up delivered pretty much the same result, though this time, DDR5 6400 using a 2133 MHz fabric frequency did provide the best results. We only saw a noticeable drop-off in performance with DDR5 5200 and 4800. Spider-Man Remastered is very sensitive to memory bandwidth, and here we found that DDR5 6400 was faster even when running the fabric at 2000 MHz. When using the same configuration to that of the Core i5 12600K, so DDR5 6400, the 7600 was now 7% faster in this title, whereas previously it only matched the 12600K when using DDR5 6000, so that is certainly very interesting. Watch Dogs Legion has more interesting data for us. Here the DDR5 6400 memory boosts the 1% lows of the 7600X by 10% and the average frame rate by 6%, and this again pushed it ahead of the 12600K, whereas previously both delivered the same level of performance when pairing the Ryzen 5 processor with 6000 spec memory. Now, something else that I was very interested in looking at was how the 7600X handled with all 4 DIMM slots populated with DDR5 memory modules. Would DDR5 6000 still be possible, or would we reduce to a much lower memory frequency? The IMC of my 12600K, for example, can't handle the stress of 4 DDR5 6000 modules and will blue screen when gaming. Now, AMD's official memory specification for Zen 4 is DDR5 5200, as I've already noted, but that's for a 1 DPC configuration, so in other words, with just 2 memory modules installed. But for a 2 DPC configuration, so when populating all 4 DIMM slots, the official AMD frequency drops to just DDR5 3600, and this sounds rather alarming. The good news, however, being that it seems as though all Zen 4 CPUs will handle at least DDR5 5200, as my 7600X ran flawlessly with 4 DDR5 6000 modules. And this did provide a very minor performance bump, though for the most part, frame rates will be much the same using either 2 or 4 DDR5 6000 modules. Now, I'm sure some of you are wondering if Resizable BAR, or in this case AMD SAM performance, has been improved with Zen 4, so here are some results. I should also note that with AM5, Resizable BAR is now enabled by default. As for performance, at least with the 6950 XT, we're seeing very typical scaling to what we've seen with Zen 3 and Alder Lake. Horizon Zero Dawn saw a 14% uplift, 16% for Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and 15% for Halo Infinite, so nothing out of the ordinary here. And the last benchmark I have for you today is a look at the 2CU iGPU of the 7600X, which certainly isn't intended for gaming, but again, I know some of you will want to see the results. Basically, the included iGPU is as useless for gaming as Intel's iGPUs, so just 20 FPS on average in Shadow of the Tomb Raider using the lowest possible quality settings at 1080p. The iGPU is really just there so Zen 4 can better compete with Intel's CPUs, which include a weak iGPU, making Zen 4 more attractive for office use, basic mobile devices, and for use as a home theater PC. You get features such as AV1 decoding, H.264 and HEVC decode and encode, DisplayPort 2.0 and HDMI 2.1 support, along with USB Type-C. Okay, so that's the end of the benchmarks, but brace yourself because we have a lot to go over. And I think I'll start by talking a little bit about the productivity benchmarks, where performance did vary depending on the workload. For core heavy workloads, the Ryzen 5 7600X is basically a 5800X and very similar to the Core i5 12600K. So I suppose not super impressive there, given that both the 5800X and 12600K cost around $260 to $270 US, and they can also be paired with cheaper motherboards. So really, I think it's fair to say the 7600X doesn't really move the needle forward for core-heavy applications. Now, for lightly threaded applications such as Photoshop, the 7600X was much more impressive, offering around 15% more performance than the 12600K and almost 20% more than the 5800X. So at that point, if time's money, you could justify the upgrade. But this is something you'll have to research depending on the applications you use, because there's a good chance the 12600K will offer a similar level of performance. Truth be told, the 7600X, while impressive here, it's not a productivity monster. Rather, that title will likely go to the Ryzen 9 parts, and we'll be taking a look at the 16-core model in tomorrow's video. Now, moving on to gaming, and I suspect we're going to be here for a while. The 7600X is clearly very impressive when it comes to gaming, roughly matching the 12700K and 12900K in our 12-game sample, and it even edged out the Ryzen 7 5800X 3D, which is mighty impressive. It's also got the 12600K's number, winning by a 10% margin, a margin that would likely grow just a little bit had I used 6400 memory rather than the 6000 memory. So let's talk about cost per frame, based on the 1% low data from our 12-game average. If we were to just look at the CPU itself, from a value perspective, the 7600X is not amazing, certainly not to the degree that I'd say you'd rush out and buy it. Yes, performance overall was impressive, but at $300 US, it's not earth-shattering, basically only matching the cost per frame of the 12600K and edging out the 5800X by a mere 4%, though the 5700X would jump ahead here. Then when compared to the 5600X, the 7600X is coming in at a massive 26% increase in cost per frame, and that margin would probably grow to as much as 50% if we were to use the cheaper $160 5600. Having said all of that though, for those of you after 12700K like performance, the 7600X represents pretty great value, saving you almost 30% per frame, and it's significantly better value than the much loved 5800X 3D. So it's by no means poor value for a high-end gaming solution. But what if we add in the cost of a 32GB memory kit? On AM4, $230 will buy you a DDR4 3600CL14 kit, which would be around 5% faster than what was shown here, but let's stick with the numbers that we have for now. Then the DDR5 6000CL30 and 6400CL32 kits both cost $280 US. Then the DDR5 6000 CL30 and 6400 CL32 kits both cost $280 US, yet despite increasing the overall cost of the 7600X, it actually helps better position it, as overall costs of all options have increased, and now the total cost for the 7600X option is 36% higher than that of the 5600X, whereas previously when just accounting for the CPU, it was 54% more expensive. So, despite the high price of DDR5 memory, if you want 32GB, the value of the 7600X isn't bad relative to existing AM4 CPUs, and again, it matched the 12600K. Of course, the 5600X works well with just 16GB in most games, so for budget-conscious shoppers, it's still a much better value option, and if saving money is the priority here, then you'd go with either the Ryzen 5 5600 non-X or something like the Core i5 12400. But if you're seeking premium performance, the 7600X certainly looks good, beating the Core i7 12700K overall while costing 17% less per frame, even when including the cost of memory. That said, you can pair the Intel Alder Lake CPUs with DDR4 memory, and a 32GB kit of DDR4 3200CL14 costs $200 US. So a reasonable saving here compared to DDR5. So if we include the DDR4 numbers for Intel 12th gen processors, we see that the 12600K creeps closer to the 7600X in terms of value, but higher end parts like the 12700K still can't compete. And that all brings us to the cost per frame data, including the cost of not just the CPU and memory, but also the motherboard. And this one is a real kick in the teeth for those of you hoping to upgrade to AM5. I'm going to use MSI as a price gauge here, as they were able to provide MSRP pricing of their entire range, and the base model MSI Pro X670-P Wi-Fi, which is an X670 board and not an X670E board. It's $290 US, and that is brutally expensive. For context, the equivalent Z690 motherboard, so the MSI Pro Z690-A DDR5, is $210, but that board has regularly been on sale for as low as $160 US. Now, you can certainly purchase a Z690 DDR5 board for around $160, but I'm going to go with $210, as that does generally land you a much higher quality model, and it still means the base model MSI X670 board will cost almost 40% more. Still, you do have all the numbers you need here to make your own pricing adjustments and calculations, so feel free to do that. For the DDR4 12th gen configurations, you can get good quality boards such as the MSI Pro Z690-P DDR4 for $180 US, so I've gone with that, and for the AM4 CPUs, the Asus TUF Gaming X570 plus Wi-Fi for $180 is a great value option. I know there are cheaper B550 boards, but we're not looking at budget CPUs here, so I really do think a more premium option is called for. Again, if you're wanting to save money and focus more on value, the 7600X is just not going to be the CPU for you. Rather, think Ryzen 5 5600 or Core i5 12400, for example. So, with all of those prices now punched in, we see that the 7600X package has dropped towards the middle of our graph. When compared to the 12600K using DDR5 memory, it's around 6% more expensive per frame, so not bad, but also not amazing for a new product. The 12600K using DDR4 isn't much better, and it's really not until we drop down to the much cheaper 5600X that we see a significant saving of 18% per frame. But as we've seen previously, for premium tier performance, the 7600X, it's not bad in terms of value, even when considering the extreme cost of X670 motherboards. For example, although X670 motherboards cost almost 40% more than Z690 boards used by the 12700K, the fact that the Core i7 processor costs a little over 30% more, but was slightly slower on average, does balance out the results and nudges the 7600X ahead by a slim margin. So, depending on how you look at it, the Ryzen 5 7600 could be really impressive, offering high-end gaming performance at very competitive pricing, or perhaps disappointing, as existing products can typically offer a similar level of performance for less money. As I've said a few times now, if value and spending as little money as possible is your primary concern, then right now AM5 it simply won't be all that appealing, as the cost of the CPUs themselves is high, they require premium DDR5 memory, and of course the cost of X670 motherboards is extreme. Therefore, value shoppers will still want to turn to AM4 or Intel's 12th generation, and personally I think it is hard to go past the Core i5 12400F on a decent B660 board. You can essentially get the CPU and motherboard for less than the cost of the 7600X. However, for high-end shoppers, I believe the 7600X represents pretty great value, and while it might only be 7 to 10% faster than the 12600K, depending on which metric you look at, I think this graph paints a pretty picture for Zen 4. The reason being, for nearly half of the games tested, the 7600X was a good bit faster, and we saw numerous examples where the margin is extreme, so 20% or more. Not only that, but when the 7600X lost to the 12600K, it only did so by low single-digit margins. Now, will this hold true for, say, a 50-game benchmark? At this point in time, I honestly have no idea, but typically a 12-game sample is a reasonable indication of what you can expect to see across a wide range of games. Of course, the real killer here for AM5 so far is motherboard pricing. Had the MSRP for entry-level boards been more like $200, then the 7600X would be a no-brainer, offering a similar cost per frame to that of the 5600X when considering the entire platform cost. Pricing of X670 boards is expected to improve, but they'll almost certainly command a hefty premium for the remainder of the year. Now, AMD has promised AM5 boards will start at $125 US, and we expect that'll happen with B650 boards, so hopefully those boards aren't trash, as the 7600X on a $125 US board would be incredible value, especially as DDR5 pricing continues to tumble. Speaking of which, it is worth noting that while still quite expensive, DDR5 memory has rapidly tumbled in value this year. For example, just 8 months ago, DDR5 6400 CL32, the kit that I use for testing Intel's 12th gen CPUs, that was priced at $610 US, and has since dropped in price every single month and currently sits at $290 US. That's just over a 50% reduction in price in a little over half a year. Given all of that, I expect before year's end, DDR5 pricing will look even better, and by midway through next year, be at parity with DDR4, or at least DDR4 of today, as pricing on that end might start to increase as supply runs out. As for what type of DDR5 memory you should pair with Zen 4, it's difficult to say right now. AMD claims DDR5 6000 is the sweet spot, but our 7600X saw good gains of up to 7% using DDR5 6400, and stability wasn't an issue with a fabric frequency of 2133 MHz. So we'll have to see if that's the case for most CPUs. It was amazing to find that the 7600X had no trouble running at DDR5 6000 with 4 memory modules installed, a strong indication that AMD's IMC is stronger than that of Intel's 12th gen. So should you buy the Ryzen 5 7600X? Well, as always, that depends. But I think if you're after high-performance gaming, it is a great option. But also, for just $100 more, I'm keen to see what the Ryzen 7 7700X has to offer. There's also Intel's 13th gen Core series codenamed Raptor Lake incoming, so I'd hold off on any purchase until those parts arrive. Having said all of that though, the elephant in the room is platform support. We're fully expecting Intel to axe their existing platform support after Raptor Lake, meaning any upgrade beyond that will require a new motherboard. AMD, on the other hand, has already committed to the AM5 socket up to and through 2025, while noting support of 2025 plus, so it won't necessarily end in 3 years' time. In any case, that means at least 2 more CPU generations on AM5, and I expect Zen 6 will be worth the upgrade for those buying Zen 4 now. So while motherboard pricing might be high, buying a decent board now with the expectation of slotting in a future CPU for a big and very convenient upgrade is all too appealing for me. Sure, you might miss out on some new future features, but most gamers will be fine with PCIe 5.0. I think that's going to be more than sufficient for many years to come. Still, I should note that it is well worth waiting to see what Intel has for us next month, so I wouldn't rush out and buy right away. Some patience here might pay off. And I think that's where I'm going to end my Ryzen 5 7600X review. There's still things to look at: overclocking, memory tuning, maybe IPC, who knows. There's a lot more tests. There's only so much I can cram into a single review. We have more chips to look at. So rather than look at stuff like overclocking, which I don't think will be too fruitful, I've prioritized other things like looking at, 4 memory modules, resizable bar, different memory kits, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, but as I said, still loads of testing to do, lots of exciting big benchmarks planned, and of course the next gen GPUs, they'll be really fun to try it on these CPUs as well as the upcoming Raptor Lake stuff. So stay tuned, make sure you're subscribed, and I'm going to get back to work. If you want to become a Hardware Unboxed community member, support the work we do here, and get some really awesome perks in return, then we have Floatplane or Patreon. You get access to monthly live streams. This month's live stream with Tim and myself should be very interesting. We get together and answer your questions live, behind the scenes content, Q&As, and we have an awesome exclusive Discord server with just the best hardware community there. So very cool stuff. But if you're not interested in any of that, that is fine, and I would like to thank you for watching the video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.